Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCullum, and I'm here today at the Rock Island Auction Company taking a look at some of the firearms that they're going to be selling in their upcoming September of 2017 premiere auction. And today we have a very unusual and very cool early Russian submachine gun to take a look at. This is a PPD-40, although it's actually got some PPD-38 parts in it, which is even more interesting. Now, PPD stands for something Degtyarev. It's like pistol pulymet. It means submachine gun, designed by Fyodor Degtyarev. Now, Degtyarev is probably better known for his light machine gun, the DP-27 or DP-28. And what's kind of interesting is that Degtyarev's first foray into the submachine gun world in 1929 involved building a gun that was basically a submachine gun version of his DP light machine gun. It had a pan magazine on top, it had the whole back end, the buttstock, and the disassembly mechanism was all modeled exactly on the DP-27. Interesting. But he pretty quickly realized that that was not the way to make a cost-effective submachine gun. So he developed some revised models, went from a 22-round, interestingly, pan magazine on top to a 25-round curved stick magazine. This is, of course, in the 7.62 Degtyarev caliber, developed by Degtyarev, who is also participating in these series of submachine gun trials in the Soviet Union. In 1932, the Soviets tested something like 14 different submachine gun designs, and most of them had various types of problems. The two that really came out on top were the early version of this one by Degtyarev and a similar gun by Degtyarev. Now, Degtyarev's gun was lighter, but Degtyarev's gun was simpler and cheaper to manufacture. It was considered more accurate, and it was also more reliable. So Degtyarev's gun came out on top. And at that point, it was using a box magazine, a 25-round stick mag. In 1934, this would actually be adopted by the Soviet Army, although they didn't manufacture them very quickly. For the first couple of years, they only made a few dozen per year. By the late 1930s, they were making between 1,000 and 2,000 per year. But then in 1939, because there were some particularly dense people in the Soviet war ministry at that point, they actually issued an order to pull all of the submachine guns out of military service and stick them in depots. Just storage out of the way. Apparently there were some generals who really did not like the idea of a submachine gun and wanted to stick with everyone having bolt-action Mosin-Nagant rifles. So, boy, you think that your own military commanders have some dumb ideas, be happy that they aren't that dumb. Well, the Soviets, fairly shortly after that, got into a shooting war with the Finns. The Finns, of course, had M31 Suomi submachine guns, which bear a not totally accidental resemblance to this version of the PPD. The Finns did extremely good work with submachine guns, and that was enough to convince the Soviet military that this submachine gun thing, it really was worth doing. So they got jumping on trying to get submachine guns back into service, and the first one that was put into major production was the PPD. Now, this had gone through a number of iterations. Of course, the 1929 model had this pan magazine. The 1932, 34, the model that got adopted in 34 had a stick magazine. Now, in 1938, Degtyarev made a number of changes to the design to make it a little simpler and to address some problems that had come up during its early fielding with the Red Army. One thing they wanted to do was to increase the practical rate of fire, and the way to do that was to increase the magazine size. So in 38, the most distinctive change that Degtyarev made was to design a drum magazine kind of like this one, except that it was equipped with a little feed tower, so that it could feed in the exact same way that the box magazine had. At this point, the gun still had one continuous stock across here, and so the 34/38 guns could use either style of magazine, either this new 73-round drum or the 25-round box magazine. In 1940, that changed again, and the tower feed drum wasn't all that suitable. And you know what? Those Finns that the Russians were fighting now had an extremely good drum design with their KP-31 submachine guns, the Suomis. And so the Russians, they probably wouldn't want to admit this, but they basically just straight up copied the Suomi drum. And that required a little bit of a change to the receiver design here because the Finnish drum, the Finnish style of drum, doesn't have a tower, it has to go directly into the receiver. So the stock was split. There's now a forward section and a rear section. The drum fits in the middle. It's now a 71 round drum, and it worked really quite well. This drum would go on to be used in the PPSH-41, which the Russians would make a gazillion of. The PPD-40 itself was only in production basically for 1 year. These were manufactured in 1940. They made a little over 81,000 of them in 1940, and then just briefly at the beginning of 1941, and this is actually a 1941 gun. They made almost 6,000 in 41. Here we have the basic markings on the PPD. This is about all you get. We have a 1941 production date, so the receiver on this one is really quite late. A Cyrillic double prefix serial number at the bottom, and then a little tiny stamp below that. And if we look closer, we'll see that little tiny stamp is an SA in a box, indicating that this was actually a Finnish capture gun, which would have been captured during the Winter War or the Continuation War and put back into Finnish service. This sort of submachine gun would have been quite familiar to the Finns. After all, its drum magazine is basically copied from the Finnish Suomi. I should correct myself. I said earlier that this is the same drum as in the PPSH-41. They are virtually identical, but there's a slight difference in the feed lips. PPSH-41 drums can be adapted to the PPD, and I believe that's what this one is, although I'm not 100% sure on that. Anyway, a couple of the controls that are worth pointing out include the selector. So we have a flag lever here. That is a 1 for semi-auto. If we flip it over, it is a 71 for dumping the entire drum. There is no safe version of this. This is a semi and full auto selector. The safety is located on the bolt handle. It is this tab, which you can push in to lock the bolt in position, either at the front here or at the back here. So with the bolt locked in position, pulling the trigger does nothing. And that was how Degtyarev decided to handle the safety. And this works really quite well because locked open like this, well, the gun's safe. However, one of the common safety problem on submachine guns of this vintage is having them closed on an empty chamber with a loaded magazine, with the potential for this to bump back and chamber around and fire unintentionally. On the PPD, you can simply lock the bolt in the forward position, and you can carry it that way and have no risk of an accidental discharge. There is a bit of a conundrum to this particular gun in that early PPDs had a tangent sight like this, but the late ones, and from the 1941 date, we would expect this to be a fairly late gun, late ones typically had just a simpler leaf sight, and I don't have a good explanation for that. I'm not sure what led to that. However, the other thing we can see is that this gun does have some mixed parts based on serial number. So this is 153. Our bolt components are going to be numbered 866. So let's take a look inside because there is an interesting element to the bolt. Disassembly, of course, we will start by removing the magazine. So push that tab in, pull the drum out. The drum has a very tight fit into the gun, and that's a good thing. I think one of the reasons that this type of drum, virtually this exact drum, had reliability trouble in the PPSH submachine guns that would follow this was because they weren't particularly tightly fitted or well fitted. The Suomi worked great with these drums, and the PPD-40 I suspect did as well, because there's just no room for play when you have the drum locked in the gun. Anyway, with the drum out, all we have to do is unscrew the rear end cap of the gun. There will be some spring pressure here at the end, so you don't want it to go flying. However, as submachine guns go, that's actually a pretty short recoil spring. And with it out, the bolt just comes right out the back of the gun. Now I believe this is a PPD-38 bolt. You can see its serial number there, 866, which does not match the receiver of the gun. And then we actually have the early version of the firing pin in this bolt. So by the final large-scale production of the PPD-40, the bolt just had a fixed firing pin, very much like you would see on everything else contemporary by that point. However, the earlier versions of the gun had this cam-actuated firing pin, where we have a cam right here, And while this is traveling, it's going to sit flat like this, parallel, or at the same height as these bearing surfaces on the bolt body. And then when the bolt hits the breech face, that gets pushed up, and that cams the firing pin forward to fire the gun. The idea here was that you would not have an exposed firing pin when the bolt wasn't fully home and in a safe position to fire. But it turns out that that's not really a necessary thing, and it's certainly something that's takes some machine time that's easy to cut out when you decide that you just really need a lot more guns a lot more quickly. As the Russians came to really appreciate the utility of the submachine gun, the PPD would show a serious flaw, namely it was too expensive and too time-consuming to manufacture. And if the Soviets were going to be making hundreds of thousands of submachine guns, they needed something that could be done quicker. Now, the PPD had, it was a cool design in the first place in that it was largely made out of drawn tube and bar stock. Most of the parts on this gun could actually be manufactured on lathes, which is going to be faster than mills. However, they just weren't fast enough. And Shpagin came up with a design for a submachine gun that was largely based on stamped steel components. Not like complex German stampings, but simple, rugged stampings. And that would be adopted as the PPSH-41, and that is the reason that PPD production ended in basically the very early weeks of 1941. That new PPSH-41 design was a much more economical gun to make. They could crank those out a lot faster, and that would become the Soviet standard submachine gun until 1943, when they replaced it with yet a faster and easier to produce model. So, hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. It was very cool to get to take a look at not just a Soviet subgun, but an early Soviet submachine gun, and a Finnish capture one at that. Very cool. If you're interested in having this one yourself for your own personal collection, it is a fully transferable NFA registered submachine gun. So take a look at the description text below, and you'll find a link to Rock Island's catalog page on it, where you can see their description and pictures and place a bid online, over the phone, or live here at the auction. Thanks for watching.